Hi everybody, David Bozell, Media Research Center. Welcome to a very special edition of the NewsBusters podcast. We are honored to have with us the chairman of the Federal Communications Commission, Chairman Brendan Carr. Thanks for
Yeah, good to be with you.
Appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks so much.
Happy No King's Day to all who celebrate. And happy Free Speech Week. This is we're going to air this next Tuesday. I want to ask you first, right out of the gates. You're battling traffic to get here every single morning. Beautiful new digs at the FCC. What is your chief responsibility as you come through those front doors? Because you're wearing a lot of hats.
Yeah. Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me on, and thank you for all the great work that you and everyone at MRC has been doing. I mean, shining a spotlight on the bias, frankly, that we've seen permeating a lot of the legacy mainstream media has been a tremendous value. And frankly, reforming where we are as a media policy matter is one of the top jobs that I think about here. And if you step back, President Trump has fundamentally changed the game when it comes to legacy media. For years, you had politicians and people in government who simply accepted the fact that national programmers like Disney and Comcast, based in New York and Hollywood, would get to set the narrative, that they could decide what the American people think, what we get to say. And President Trump ran directly at that and smashed the facade that they're in control. And we're seeing all sorts of consequences flow from that. I think it's our job at the FCC to really reinvigorate the public interest standard. Because again, licensed broadcast television is fundamentally different than any other form of communication, whether it's a cable channel or a podcast or a soapbox on the street. When you're looking at all of those, they're not licensed by the FCC. And therefore, what we want there is just the most wide open, robust debate possible. When it comes to licensed broadcast TV, they have an FCC license, and what that means, they have a public interest obligation. And again, they've been given a monopoly on the airwaves by the federal government. In exchange for that, they need to serve the needs of the local communities. But over the last couple decades, we've seen the FCC, frankly, walk away from enforcing the public interest standard. And we look at trusted media in decline. That's not a good thing.
So get to that.
We're seeing a lot of change right now. And I think it comes from President Trump. I think it comes from you all. You all carried the mantle, for instance, on NPR and PBS for years.
Right across the street. I didn't realize NPR is right across the street.
Exactly, yeah. And now, a couple months into this administration, we have, NPR defunded, PBS defunded.
Should we move into that building?
Yeah, take it over next. Take it over next. And frankly, just up and down, we're seeing real change. I mean, CBS now is committed to restoring fact-based journalism. They have a bias ombudsman over there. We're seeing a lot of changes across the media ecosystem, and it's a real good thing. We're not there yet in terms of mission accomplished, but we're heading in the right direction.
So I know you're an Office fan. I saw you tweet at Stelter when the Kimmel stuff was going down. Explain to me, like I'm 5 years old, what it means to protect the public interest. And is that just the public writ large, or does that apply to the affiliates as well?
Yeah, so when you think about the media ecosystem, it's simple to think about it in two main buckets. So on the one hand, you've got what we call the national programmers. So that's Disney, that's Comcast, that's Paramount, that's Fox News. They're the national programmers. They're not licensed by the FCC. They have no public interest obligation. They can do whatever it is that they want. They produce the TV shows, including 60 Minutes and late night shows and NFL football, that are then distributed through licensed local TV stations. So there's thousands of TV stations out there, just for national programmers. And those licensed TV stations that distribute the programming from ABC and CBS, they are licensed by the FCC. And they have an obligation to serve the public interest, which means looking out for the needs of the local community. And frankly, for years, I heard from local TV stations that said, we want to push back when we get programming from New York and Hollywood that we don't think matches the needs of our local community. But we've never felt like the FCC would have our back, or that we'd have the power to push back. In the last couple of weeks with Kimmel, one of the things that happened there that's a really, really good win is for the first time in probably 30 years, you had local TV stations that pushed back and said, we don't want to run the Kimmel program right now. Now look, they were never going to be able to hold out forever, just given the balance of power. But the fact that they went a week and said, we don't think right now is the right time for this particular programming, I think it's a win for re-empowering those local broadcasters. And what does the public interest standard mean? Among other things, it means you can't run sort of a narrow partisan circus and ultimately be holding a broadcast license. You can do that on cable. You can do that on a podcast. But licensed broadcast TV is just fundamentally different.
So we know the Kimmel situation. We know that Disney had control and command and control over whether to pull him and whether to bring him back. But did Kimmel's situation create a precedent where the affiliates now can start to be a little bit more aggressive, and whether it's Kimmel or Fallon or someone else that comes down the line, are they coming to you and saying, do we have the authority to make a fuss, essentially, and say, these guys are not representing our local community?
Yeah, I sure hope that they feel empowered and that they will feel like the FCC will have their back. We're doing a couple things to maybe encourage that to take place. One, we are right now looking at what are called the affiliate agreements. So again, national programmers, local TV stations, the relationship between them is governed by a contract called the affiliate agreement. And there's ways in which the national programmers can be using those contracts to exert too much pressure on the local affiliate and therefore interfering with their ability to serve the public interest. And so we're looking at those contracts right now to see if there's additional protections we can put in place to make sure that those local affiliates feel like they can meet the public interest in it. And we're also going to be looking at the preemption right. Again, this is what happened with the Kimmel episode, is they preempted that program. But ultimately, again, Disney and others have a lot of ways to punish local TV stations for daring to push back. And so I want to look at ways that we can strengthen that right to preempt, because I do think it's a good precedent that we should build on.
People forget PBS preempted a program. Local PBS stations preempted a program years ago, and so these guys have always had the power to do so. So the fact that you're re-engaging them and giving them, showing them that they do in fact have the statutory authority to preempt is, I think, is a good thing. Turning to media trust for a second, Gallup came out with a poll last Thursday. 28% of the country believes the media. Republican believability rate on the media has long been in the toilet. Democrats have started to come down. Only 51% of Democrats believe the media now. If that number, I hate to ask you a speculative question, but I will. If that number from Gallup, from Democrats, were to come down under 50%, and now at this point you have the two major parties not believing the media, what do you think the FCC's response? I mean, President Trump has been talking about license revocation, citing the Media Research Center study and the negative coverage. But Democrat trust in the media is teetering. If that went under 50% and the majority of both parties didn't believe the press, what would the FCC's response be?
Yeah. I think what this Gallup poll confirms is that now more Americans have trust in gas station sushi than they do in sort of legacy mainstream media. And it's a problem of the media's own making. Well, I'd really say there's two causes for this. One, the legacy mainstream media missed some of the biggest, most important stories of the last 5 or 10 years. Hunter Biden laptop story, gone. COVID origins, total miss. Whips at the border. Remember that sort of story that premiered? There was all these stories about emergency rooms in the Midwest being shut down from ivermectin overdoses that ended up being complete hoaxes, not true. Covington Catholic. And you go down the line, Jussie Smollett. Major, major important stories. The reason why this news media should exist, and they're 180 wrong on it. So I think it's a massive indictment on themselves. Second, Americans now have access to...
I'll give you one more example real quick. The Florida trucker. The illegal Florida trucker kills 3 people in Florida. Okay, we did a study on this. 0 seconds of coverage for that guy. Okay, meanwhile they're running Maryland Man morning, noon, and night. Okay, but they covered 4 car accidents that month. Okay, so they're not immune to covering car accidents. Okay, but they didn't cover the guy, the illegal immigrant who killed 3 Floridians. So I'm sorry.
Yeah, no, it's right. I mean, the news is what you focus on, but the second piece is, Americans now have a broader access to a diverse range of news information, particularly the internet, and particularly, I think, X. And X, under latest management, allows people to get access to news information. So you have ways to debunk and to get information that the legacy mainstream media had been censoring and blocking. So I think it's a combination of their own missing of stories. And it's not just innocent missing, right? These misses all go one way. And the access to a greater multiplicity of viewpoints from the internet that has resulted in this just absolute cratering of trust in mainstream media. And it's a crisis of their own making, and they need to find a way to solve it. Again, I think it's not really on me per se to solve it, but I do think we haven't helped by walking away from enforcing the public interest standard and say you can run whatever you want, and there's never going to be a consequence. I mean, look, I've said from the get-go, licenses, broadcast licenses, are not sacred cows. If you think there's nothing you can do to lose a license, then it's not a license. That's called a property right. And that's something very fundamentally different. And so I'm very open to the idea that there's broadcasters out there that may very well end up losing their licenses. Now, of course, there's a whole process that has to be run there, that people don't really focus on. But to revoke a license.
So again, if the two parties, both by majority, did not believe the press, and I would think by extension, there would be some momentum to revoke the licenses because of their lack of believability. What would happen next? I mean, can the public petition you? To rebuild this thing.
Two things. There's the actual process that takes place to revoke a license. There's a couple ways you can do it, but in the main, you have to issue what's known as a hearing designation order at the FCC. So Congress, through statute, doesn't allow the commission itself to go directly to pulling a license. They say you have to set it for hearing. So you have to have a hearing, which can take a multi-month process. And there's a fact finder, and then ultimately at the end of that hearing, you can have a determination of a license revocation. So there is sort of a process under the statute that you have to follow. But this idea of looking at licensees is nothing new. I know a lot of people saw the Kimmel episode and they thought that history started right then, but it didn't. I've been at this FCC since 2012, back when I actually had some hair. I've been a commissioner since 2017.
Right.
And there's long-running precedent to try to hold broadcasters accountable. For instance, back in 2018, you had a whole bunch of Senate Democrats, including Senator Markey and Blumenthal, write the FCC a letter asking us to launch an investigation into Sinclair, which is a company that owns local TV stations that Democrats think is too right-wing from their perspective. Right. They asked us to take enforcement action against Sinclair for news distortion, for broadcast hoax, including, they asked, up to, potentially including license revocations. You had a group of conservatives in South Florida that tried to buy a Spanish-language radio station.
No kidding.
And there was a bunch of Democrats that expressly came out and said, you can't, FCC, approve that deal because it'll hurt Democrats' chances at the ballot boxes. Or you had a Fox broadcast, not Fox News Cable, but Fox broadcast TV station in Philadelphia, who had a license up for renewal, and a bunch of leftist activists tried to get the FCC to hold that up, the renewal, and the FCC did. Under the Biden years, they sought comment on effectively revoking the license of the Fox Philadelphia station. And so the FCC over the Biden years created some precedent that we can now build on when it comes to holding broadcasters accountable. But the other upshot of all this is people are moving away from legacy media, and what they're tuning on to is podcasts, or tuning on to streaming services, or turning on to X. And so I just think, part of the consequence of that lack of trust is the eyeballs are just moving elsewhere, and the relevance of the legacy outlets is continuing to decline.
Well, it gives the conservative media ecosystem an opportunity to mature.
Well, and this is interesting. So some people are criticizing a lot of conservatives. Why are they dominating so much on new alternate sources? And I would say, well, one reason is because they were kicked out of legacy mainstream media, their perspective, a long time ago. And so a lot of conservatives have had years now necessarily to invest in these new forms of communications and new platforms. And those new platforms happen to be very popular right now. And so,
That's true. Okay, I want to give you an opportunity to respond to the American Enterprise Institute, October 8th. They had a panel in which they criticized your approach, calling it anti-free speech. What do you say to that? How do you see that in your role to make sure that the broadcasters on the public airwaves are staying accountable to the public?
Well, look, I'm not familiar with that event, but what I'll say is I'll put my approach to free speech up against anybody's. When it comes to social media, when it comes to streaming, when it comes to podcasts, my record on the agency has been very clear in terms of standing up strongly for free speech. The reality, this is something that just a lot of people don't understand. It's because the nuances of telecom law don't translate well into mass media. But licensed broadcast, that one particular medium, licensed broadcast TV, is fundamentally different than those other means of communication. And there's been cases, red line, all the way to the Supreme Court, that say there's simply things you can't do on broadcast TV that you can do elsewhere. Obviously, a lot of people are aware of indecency regulations. Maybe people that are older like me remember the Janet Jackson Super Bowl halftime wardrobe malfunction. That would have been an issue on cable.
I remember that.
That wouldn't have been an issue on a streaming service. But licensed TV is simply different. And maybe people don't like that. So you can go to Congress and change that and say, look, we want to get rid of the public interest standard. We want broadcast TV to be on the same footing as everything else. We can get that. I've also thrown out the idea that maybe we should do an auction of broadcast TV spectrum, meaning if you want to keep your broadcast TV spectrum and your ability to broadcast over the airwaves, but you don't want the public interest standard, then you can buy your way out of the public interest standard, and then you can be treated equally to others. But again, originally the spectrum went to broadcasters for free because the public interest obligation was there. So if you don't want it anymore, that's fine.
Right.
But we should be able to recoup more of the value of that spectrum for the taxpayer.
You've made some news this week. The FCC has expelled the Hong Kong Telecom from our telecommunications networks. And you've also barred some Chinese electronic parts. The same week that President Trump has increased Chinese tariffs 100%. I can't help to think that some of those three things might be linked. Explain the rationale.
One of our big work streams here is national security at the FCC. In fact, when I first started as chairman, we set up a new council on national security within the FCC to bring all of these work streams together. And we have taken increasing number of actions in the past week. One thing we did that I think you alluded to was we launched something called Operation Clean Carts. Okay. So if you look at sort of large online retailers where a lot of people do their shopping, you could find on there.
Amazon, Walmart.
We haven't named names, but you're close to the target.
Fair enough.
Something like that. You could go on those websites, and there were millions, literally millions, of ultimately CCP spy gear that was allowed to be distributed and sold on that website, even though it's prohibited by the FCC. So again, if you have Huawei or ZTE gear, prohibited gear from our view because we think it's insecure, you can't sell that in the U.S. But yet we found that a lot of that equipment was still being sold on these online retailers. So we launched this Operation Clean Cart. We reached out to them, and they agreed to remove the gear, which something that actually surprised me, because sometimes they push back and say, well, we have a right under Section 230 or otherwise to do it. Right. But they agreed to remove it and put in new measures, both algorithm and manual reviews, to stop that stuff. So that was a good win. And look, again, we were one of the first agencies years ago in Trump 45 to stop Huawei and ZTE gear from coming in, but there's always more to do on that. There's always people that are looking for end runs and shortcuts. So we're going to continue to be vigilant in protecting America's communications infrastructure.
Brendan, I've long thought that the 2024 race was probably the last sort of authentic presidential race that we'll see maybe perhaps in our lifetime. I think next cycle is going to be more synthetic media than we've ever experienced before. AI is going to mature. You could see the political ads, all AI driven. What's the FCC's role in policing AI-produced political speech? Yeah,
it's a good question. During the Biden years, in the run-up to the 24 election, at a point in time when there's a lot of press coverage about Republicans sort of running away with what was then referred to as the meme wars, right? Doing better on sort of online content and generating videos, generating pictures. There was a push on the left when they thought they were losing the meme wars to have the FCC heavily regulate the use of AI in political advertising. In fact, the prior Biden FCC proposed rules that would require broadcasters to disclose if AI was used in any way in an ad. The FCC's authority to do that is exceedingly limited, and so I think my view at the time then, and it extends to now, is if we're going to have regulation of political speech, which is really what that is, it should either come from the FEC, with the narrow set of authorities that it has, if any, to reach this, or from Congress, but the FCC itself, I don't think should sort of expand our remit, in part because we don't touch every means of communication. Again, we could potentially do something, potentially, I don't think so.
So you don't touch, but you don't touch the 5G spectrum.
That we do, but when it comes to like broadcast TV, you could potentially have some regulations there. I'm not sure I agree with it, but potentially. Yeah. But you couldn't put them on, per se, cable or streaming or podcast. So if the FCC were to be the one to do this, it would have a very asymmetric impact, where if someone like the FEC or Congress does it, you can create a level set of rules across various different means of communications.
I got you. Rural broadband, within the FCC's purview. Yep. I've long thought that President Trump and the United States should be a vanguard in rural broadband and get this done and connect, I think, the remaining 5% of the country, if they want. If you had to build our rural broadband infrastructure from scratch, how would you have done it?
Well, the most important principle is one that we call technology neutral. So for years, the vast majority, if not almost exclusively, of the funding that went into subsidizing internet builds in rural areas went into fiber. And fiber is a phenomenal technology. I've been all across the country. I've spliced fiber. I've seen it work. But it can be very expensive. It can be $50,000, $60,000, $70,000 a mile to run fiber. So you're looking at in excess of $100,000 sometimes to connect a single home to fiber. $100,000 of taxpayer dollars to connect one home to the internet. Now, we have different technologies now. We have fixed wireless. We've got this latest generation of low Earth orbit satellites, including Starlink, that can do it for pennies on the dollar. And so I think one area where we're trying to reorient is to be much more tech neutral. Again, in years past, it was the FCC and other funding agencies put a very heavy thumb on the scale to only fund fiber. But now that we're at this point of the digital divide, where it's very expensive locations, plus these new technologies, making sure we have more room for those technologies to succeed helps. Now, we have a big shot here to get this done because if you remember, during the Biden years, Vice President Harris was in charge of this $42 billion effort to bridge the digital divide, to bring millions of Americans across the finish line.
I should have bet the under on that one.
Yeah. And in fact, after more than 1,000 days, that $42 billion program under Vice President Harris's leadership connected exactly 0 households.
Yeah.
Not one shovel's worth of dirt was turned. Now, Secretary Lutnick has come in, and he has totally revamped that program quickly, reset the playing field, and the funding is now going to start to roll. We're not going to need $42 billion,
right,
but a big portion of that funding is now going to roll to rural areas to help us end the digital divide. And so that's going to be a really big win for President Trump and Secretary Lutnick in the coming months as that rolls out.
Great. TikTok. I know the deal is sort of unfolding before our eyes. What role does the FCC play in declaring that the spyware has been removed from the new and improved TikTok?
Look, I think President Trump has fundamentally altered our approach to dealing with the threats from communist China. And when TikTok as an app first came onto the scene, I think people weren't really wise to the risks, and we had to sort of address something to some extent after the horse was already out of the barn. Congress stepped in with TikTok. They passed a law, and President Trump and his team have been negotiating to make sure that as TikTok gets to continue, it does so with appropriate national security guardrails that have been missing for years before that. And I think that's sort of the right precedent. I think going forward, as new apps come online, we don't want to be back into the TikTok situation of playing catch up. And I think President Trump has us postured correctly with respect to communist China, so we don't see that again. I was just kind of curious,
where in the federal bureaucratic tree does it fall to have the responsibility to declare that the app is clean? Do I just trust the intelligence community to make that declaration, or does FCC have a role in peering and looking under the hood?
In the main, this is actually sort of a component of Treasury called CFIUS, because when it comes to TikTok and others, it's foreign investment into sort of this U.S. Offered product, and so they run a very, very sort of detailed process before they sign off on things like that.
Okay. Could you see the U.S. ever leading kind of a digital NATO, kind of an alliance of free speech nations and a digital bloc of nations committed to free speech principles, and then on the other side, a bloc of nations, just under state control in their digital communications? Do you see a digital NATO kind of unfolding in the years ahead?
Well, that type of divide that you're talking about is one that we're seeing, and that's emerging right now. And I think Europe is sort of an interesting.
You've been critical of Europe's Digital Control Act.
I think Europe is really at a crossroads. So if you look at the most modern technological breakthrough right now is AI, and President Trump and Vice President Vance have been very clear that the United States is going to lead the world when it comes to this next generation technology. And we've already seen that China has a very different approach to AI. You can look at some of their early versions of AI that China has put out there, DeepSeek and others. And for instance, if you ask AI from China, what happened at Tiananmen Square, they say nothing, it was a great day. If you ask them how the Uyghurs are doing, they'll say they're fine, they're getting a nice education in camp-like settings. And so we're really at a crossroads, which is, do you want AI free from ideological bias, or do you want the AI that's being offered by China, which is deeply, deeply biased AI? And I think Europe finds itself at a crossroads. Are they going to turn towards the United States and join with us and benefit from gold standard AI, or are they going to allow China to succeed in this space? And Europe is in a tough spot because they're so overly regulatory. They have not allowed their tech companies to get to scale. They have effectively regulated them to death, and now they're trying to export that regulation to U.S. technology companies, and President Trump has been clear that we're not going to play that game. You're not going to effectively tax U.S. technology companies to pay for Europe's lack of GDP. And so I do think that we are leading the world. We are sticking up for gold standard AI. We want to be free from ideological bias, and it's up to Europe, countries in Europe and countries around the globe to choose which way they want to go.
If you had to predict a communications breakthrough in the next decade, that would force the FCC to have to reinvent itself? What do you think that might be?
Well, one technology that we're really excited about, although with a degree of humility, because you really never know how technology develops.
Yeah.
That's probably the biggest mistake a regulator can make. But there are new offerings that are coming from this explosion of low Earth orbit satellites that we're really excited about. So most people will know that for years you've been able to get high-speed internet from space based on a standalone dish. And people have known that for years they could get satellite communications to a phone, but it was sort of a clunky, bespoke phone. What's happening right now is we're able to merge those two things, meaning right to your smartphone, you can get high-speed internet messaging directly to your phone, not connecting to a cell tower, but connecting to a low Earth orbit satellite. Those are the technologies that are now being rolled out and developed. In fact, Starlink has just entered into a deal to acquire up to 50 megahertz of spectrum, which is a large chunk of spectrum, potentially to offer that type of direct-to-cell technology. And once you do that, that means dead zones are gone. That means the digital divide is effectively gone. And so I think the ability of the U.S. to lead the world.
Do you have a licensing role in that?
Yes, we have to authorize particular piece of spectrum to be used for direct-to-cell.
Okay.
And so that's one of the things that we're doing right now. So we want to make sure that the United States can lead the world when it comes to this next-generation technology, direct-to-cell.
Okay. Chairman Carr, thanks so much for joining us. Really do appreciate it.
Good to be with you. Thanks so much. Thanks for your work.
Thank you.